We're going to start, and I'll give a bit of an introduction. Uh,
Fine.
for I think most of the people in the audience here in Halifax knows me, but many of the people online don't. So I'm Larry Haven, and welcome to today's meeting and webinar featuring Dr. Hatim Kanaaneh. I'm a professor emeritus at St. Mary's University in Halifax and a member of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, which is sponsoring today's event. Other organizations sponsoring are Canadians, Arabs, and Jews for a Just Peace, a Halifax group, the Nova Scotia Public Interest Group, the Canada-Palestine Association, Kairos Halifax, and the United Network for Justice and Peace in Palestine and Israel. Independent Jewish Voices is a national human rights organization whose mandate is to promote a just resolution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine through the application of international law and respect for the human rights of all parties. There are chapters of IJV in cities across Canada, in addition to a growing number of student chapters on major university campuses. IJV supports the right of Canadians and all people to criticize and challenge the current laws and policies of the State of Israel, including through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Feel free to go to ijvcanada, one word, .org, and we gladly accept donations to support our work. Unfortunately, our speaker today can't be with us live in Halifax. He's in New York and is with us through the miracle of technology. We do have an audience gathered together in Halifax. Let's call them the live audience. And in the rest of Canada, we have an audience of people at their computers watching or on their phones listening to the webinar. Let's call them the electronic audience. So before I introduce our speaker, here's some technical details about the webinar. And these details take about as long as the presentation itself, unfortunately, but it's important for those joining us electronically. So our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes. The audiences will be able to see and hear him, and also to see a slideshow, which you're hopefully watching right now. During that time, all electronic participants are muted. At the conclusion of Dr. Kanaaneh's remarks, we'll have a question period. Members of the electronic audience, you are all presently muted, as I said. If you want to ask a question during the question period, please go to the GoToWebinar control panel, which if you have joined us, you will see in the upper right portion of your screen, and click the hand raising button, which you'll find that indicates you want to speak. I'll see your raised hand for each prospective speaker as the requests come in. I'll then call on you and unmute you in the order in which you raised your hand. I'll ask you to remember to unclick the raise hand as soon as you've finished your intervention, or it will start to get confusing. Unfortunately, we'll only be able to hear your voice, electronic participants, not see you. You can also leave a written message in the question and answer box. Members of the live audience are welcome to raise their hands and speak as well during the question period, and I'll try to alternate between the live and the electronic audience. We'll try to bring the meeting to a close after about 90 minutes. The other thing is that this webinar is being recorded, and Independent Jewish Voices will post it at its website. But if you want to receive a copy of it in MP4 format, you can get in touch with me as well. The file will be too large to send over the email, but I'll send it to you using WeTransfer or some other technique. So now to our speaker. What attention the Palestinians get is mostly directed at those living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Of the 950,000 Palestinians resident in what became Israel in 1948, the ones in the West Bank and Gaza are the descendants of those who fled or were pushed out during the 1948 war. Hardly any attention is paid to another group of Palestinians, those who stayed in what became Israel, or who fled and came back fairly soon. And our speaker can tell you a bit more about that very messy situation, about present absentees or absent presentees, I forget what they're called. Today, they number about 1.7 million, that is Palestinian citizens of Israel, or about 20% of the Israeli population. My partner Judy and I have always been interested in this group of Palestinians. Their treatment by the Jewish majority in Israel tells us volumes about the prospects for peace in the region. Israel boasts they have full and democratic rights, but is that true? In 2009, I read several books that opened my eyes to the situation, and which I strongly recommend. One was The Other Side of Israel by Susan Nathan, a British Jew who moved from Tel Aviv to a small Palestinian village in northern Galilee 6 years earlier. Her old friends told her that they were sure that she would be killed. Her new friends were a bit bemused by her presence, but accepted her quite readily. The second was Blood and Religion by Jonathan Cook, a British journalist permanently resident in Nazareth. And he wrote the introduction to Hatim's book, A Doctor in Galilee. And a later book was The Forgotten Palestinians by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. But the most fascinating read was A Doctor in Galilee by our guest today, Hatim Kanaaneh. Judy and I made the point of meeting Hatim and his wife when we were traveling in Israel and Palestine in 2009, and we were determined that we would have him here by hook or by crook, and finally we're able to bring him to you. Dr. Kanaaneh will tell you more about the topic and about himself. He needs no more introduction. Hatim, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Larry. That's very kind of you, the introduction. And I thank you for making this possible altogether. I apologize for not being able to be in person with you, but still we'll try to make the best of this arrangement. Perhaps it will be a blessing in disguise because it will attract more audience, a wider audience perhaps. At any rate, I will start by saying that I
interrupt you for a second. Just
Please.
remember, Hatim, when you want the slides advanced, you have to tell me.
Yes, I will. I have a little outline here, and I have indicated where the slides should be shown. So I'll communicate that to you. So the subject of my speech today, or my presentation, is pretty much my sort of autobiography, which I have described in my book memoirs, A Doctor in Galilee. And I think if you can put that first slide on, it will show the book cover. So that's a picture of me with a family, and that's something I want to share with you also. When I retired, I wrote this book of memoirs and published it, and the publisher said, I need a picture of you as a doctor. And that was when I retired. And I looked, and believe it or not, I didn't have a single picture of myself as a doctor treating somebody. So I went next door to my brother's family, and we played doctor and patient in their living room. So I think it says something about, I wasn't for, 35 years. It didn't occur to me that there was a photo opportunity to do a session of pictures or something. I was in this, and I hope I'll be able to convey that to you. I was in this because that was my life since I was a child. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about that. I grew up in a farming community, subsistence farming. Everybody essentially had land in a very fertile, beautiful valley in the center of Galilee. That is called the Battof Valley. Battof is a corruption apparently of Natufa. And if those who are in the know would recognize the name of the Natufians. The Natufians were supposedly the first settled agriculture community in the world. And we claim that that happened right in our land, in our Battof Valley. So everybody, including my family, my father, owned land in that valley for essentially growing grains and vegetables. And then there everybody had, in the mountainside where the village is, you have everybody had an olive orchard. And since I was a little child, again, memories come back in pushing to which ones do I share with you. So let me just tell you that what subsistence farming means. You know, that means no cash, really. The way I remember buying things for my mother is to take a couple of eggs and go to the store. That was the cash that we used. So, but since first grade, my family told me, you are a smart kid, you're going to be a doctor. And lo and behold, I believed them and I became a doctor eventually. So, do you hear me? I lost I don't see the
That's okay.
webinar. Okay, fine. So, as I say, I finished elementary school in my village, and then it so happened that my older two brothers, I mean, we were 5 brothers. The youngest 3 happened to have gone to high school. The oldest 2 didn't. So it was my 3rd brother was the first person from my village to finish high school. And I followed in his steps, and in the 4th brother's steps. The 4th brother is now a retired professor of anthropology at Birzeit University. So I was the youngest, so I was the last to join them in Nazareth in the high school, municipal high school. But that cost money. And as I said, we lived in a economy that didn't have cash. So my father made a decision for which he really was shamed by all of his neighbors and relatives. He sold his land in the Battof Valley a piece at a time to put us through high school. He didn't sell any of the olives, though, to his credit. So in 1960, after finishing high school, I insisted, and I had the chance to come to the United States to study. And I I got admission to a college in South Dakota called Yankton College, a Congregational Church college. And I left my village. My father had to sell his last piece of land in the Batof Valley to pay for my air ticket and for $500 on the black market that I took with me. And I came to the United States. This picture that you are looking at is me taking leave of my sisters and aunts and the family woman the day I left to study in the United States. I was away for 10 years, through which I moved from South Dakota to Hawaii, where I met my wife, and then to Boston, where I studied medicine and public health. And in 1970, I returned to my village called Arabi in Galilee. I returned to Arabi with a degree in medicine and a public health specialty, and from Harvard, and with a pregnant wife and with a Volkswagen camper that I used as my ambulance, and landed in Arabi again. There was no physician in that village. In fact, I was the first physician in a area of Galilee. I was the only healthcare provider for about 50,000 people around Galilee, all Palestinian community, with very few Jewish families that came to me as well. So this was in 1970, but I was trained as a public health man, public health, administration and preventive care and all of that. And I got a job with the Ministry of Health, and I started practicing. And just to make it interesting, when I started working for the Ministry of Health in Acre, the boss that I had, another a graduate of Harvard School of Public Health, she was a lady of German origin and German Jewish origin, and she liked the idea that when she saw my letter applying for a job with the ministry, she liked the idea that we both are graduates from Harvard, and she invited me to join her. I joined her as a MCH physician, maternal and child health. These are clinics that are provided by the government for all communities in Israel. At the time, about maybe less than half of the Arabic villages in Galilee had that service. So I joined, and she said, okay, here's the situation. We have one other physician, and you and him will split the responsibility for our sub-district. The sub-district had in it about 380,000 people, and the two of us had to offer the services of maternal and child health, prenatal clinics and immunization and well baby clinics and so on. So I had to share that with the one single other physician that was employed, Dr. Hansius, who was an obstetrician gynecologist. And I was supposed to handle half the population. I sat down with Dr. Frank Bloom, my boss, and I told her, that's not the way I was taught public health. I cannot but do a thorough job with my responsibility to my clients. Therefore, I'm not going to do half of the Western Galilee. So I negotiated with her to work full-time on a half-time pay, provided I work only in my community and the neighboring two villages, Arabi, Sakhnin, and Dir Hanna. Those three villages, we will remember them soon again. So those three villages were mine, three villages that added up to about 18,000 population, and Dr. Kanaaneh had the rest of the 380,000. That's how we split it. Now, that was my office job in the morning. But if you, remembering those days, I would come home from my office job in the early afternoon, and I find people waiting for me, patients who are really sick, with the children diarrhea, the usual summer diarrheas or the winter coughs and colds and what. And I couldn't tell them I do public health, I don't do clinical medicine. So pretty soon I asked my brother, and he built in the edge of his house, built me a couple of rooms that became my clinic. And so I did a morning job as administrator for eventually my boss, Dr. Hedy Frank Bloom, was kicked up one step, and I took her position. And I would work there till about 3. I come home, and I find people waiting for me already at my clinic. And I insisted on catching a nap so I can get in shape to work. And then by 5, I would start again at my clinic. There's a lot to tell, of course. I tell people that actually, if you think about it, to share with you the story of a lifetime, I need a lifetime to do that. And we have only 45 minutes. So I'll be brief if I can.
And don't forget to tell me when to advance the slides.
Yes, we are not there yet.
Okay.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that it was very hard on the family, and we had already our young daughter and another child, so we had 2 children, and my wife fended for me at night, especially with people knocking at the door. She would have to she was my triage officer. She would decide whether to wake me up or not. And one day a week, we escaped to Nahariya with good friends there that we used their guest room. And we didn't leave a telephone number or an address. We just left and we hid for 24 hours. Okay. Let's see, what's next? Okay. I just want to mention, this is apropos the fact that I was the only physician for some 50,000 people, that today, and you're going to be surprised, today, Arabi, my village, brags about being probably the #1 community in the whole world in terms of numbers of physicians per capita. We will come back to that later if you wish. But today, the village is now about 25,000 people. And every year it graduates about between 30 and 40 new physicians. Some of my family blames me for part of that, making medicine popular. But that's another story. There's a lot of other factors to take into consideration. We can come back to this if you wish later. At any rate, let me tell you about, we're talking now about 1970, but going back to the change that happened in 1948, the year of the Nakba. Nakba means catastrophe, as most of you probably know. In 1948, there was what I sort of call a civil war of some sort, and the Palestinians obviously were destined to lose, and 85% of the Palestinians who lived in the area that became Israel became refugees across the border in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and in the West Bank, the remaining part of what used to be Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. So that was in 1948. We became citizens right then and there. The government of Israel immediately gave us citizenship and then imposed military rule on the Arab population, Arab citizens of Israel. Military rule means the military governor had really an absolute authority to do whatever the hell he wanted with us. There was no recourse to anything beyond asking him to be kind. There was no way of going to court, no, at any rate. The most significant part of that period was our loss of land and the pressure on us to abandon our culture. Okay, I won't go too deep into that, but remember that military rule meant also we couldn't move, we couldn't go to work without special permit from the military governor. I couldn't go to Nazareth to study without special permit from the military governor. So, and again, the process of land confiscation. First of all, 1/4 of those who remained, of the 15% of the total original population who remained in Israel, about 1/4 to 1/3 were internally displaced. And that meant that they became internal refugees. They lost the right to their land, to their homes, to their property, including their bank accounts if they had any. That was the big sort of clump of land that the government puts its hands on, and then proceeded to take land from the others who are there and who didn't leave their homes. And as a result of that, if you bear with me, as a result of that, by now, and this is a process that never stopped, it is still going on, much slower than it was at the very beginning. The very beginning, it was absolutely very, very extensive, and all you do is you get a note from the post office notifying you that your land with the specific area and piece is needed for the public good, and you lost it. So at any rate, maybe it's more complicated than that, but that's about it. Now, that continues to the present day, but at a much slower rate. As a result of that, the Palestinians who you heard from Larry, the Palestinians who make up about 20% of Israel's citizens, actually own 3% of the land. And we cannot access 93% of Israel's total land. We cannot access it because that's held in perpetuity for the Jewish nation by law. And so you can understand how that impacts our lives, I suppose, as originally an agricultural community. Okay, well, I'll stop here on that issue. And if you would please show the audience the third slide, which shows a map of Galilee. The X's are Palestinian communities that were evacuated in 1948 and that have since been totally erased. They have been razed to the ground, all of them, almost all of them. The very few that remain, such as a community up north here that is called Sasa, where liberal American immigrants settled there in the homes that were not destroyed. But the majority of those villages have been, as I said, razed to the ground. And if you would show the next slide, please. That's there's one before that, which is the South Africa Park, if you can find it, please. This is, sorry. Okay. This one, if you hold the minute. There we have it. That's the entrance to the South Africa Park, which is actually a forest that has been planted over what used to be Lubi. Lubi was one of the better off communities, villages in Galilee. It is about maybe 2 hours walk from my village, from Arabi. But it was, as I say, because of its close distance from the city of Tiberias, it could sell its vegetables and grains and whatever produce, and it was a good, well-off village, and it resisted the advance of the Israeli armed forces in 48. And therefore, it was razed immediately and completely evacuated. And now it is, as you see, a forest, and in it there is a playground for children, and school buses come there and to take a day off from school and so on. So this is not the exception. This is the rule. Most, if not all, the villages that were raised to hide the ugly scene, they have become parks and forests. Those are the trees that you collected money in those blue or green cards or green cans or whatever. But Jewish communities across the world collected donations to support these forests that essentially stand on top of the destroyed Palestinian villages. Okay. The one group that I want to mention again is the internal refugees, about a fourth to one-third of the total Palestinian community that remained in Israel. And they are known as internal refugees, but the common official name that's given by the state is present absentees. They are present for the purpose of taxes, and they are absent in terms of their property. Okay. The other part of the military rule was the real deep infiltration of our community by the secret police. That was part and parcel of how the military government controlled the Palestinian minority. And the two main items that the military rule and the Shin Bet tried to address are the educational system, which was, you know, I graduated from high school and had to pass the matriculation exam in Torah studies, in that Old Testament studies in Hebrew, but I never was taught the Quran. You can imagine what that means. The same thing applies to anything to do with Arabic literature. All of the history of Arabic literature, Arabic is a very rich language, we were not allowed. We were taught some poetry, for example, studied poetry by and large produced by Zionist Iraqi immigrants and some local poets who said what the military government wanted to hear. So without going into that any deeper, but the majority of the Palestinians within within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, really surreptitiously and behind closed doors. I remember closing the door and listening to Arabic broadcasts on the radio in high school. It was not legitimate. So, but we very much insisted on holding on to our culture and history, and witness what happened. Under those circumstances, we produced Mahmoud Darwish, for example. I think he is the best known Arabic language poet of the 20th century. So that is to say, we never really accepted the imposed restrictions on our culture. Okay, the next slide, I think, is the Batov Valley. That's the one. That's the Batov Valley. Actually, on my left hand, and as you look at that photograph, that is on the left hand, would be the Sea of Galilee, and in the right hand, if you continue down, you will get close to the Mediterranean. It is a sizable piece of land, and here's the place to say, first of all, the water carrier, you know the story of the diversion of the Jordan River. There's a water carrier that takes the land, and you can see it at the lower left side of that picture. There's a little canal that snakes around the mountain, around the hill. Is that visible there? Yeah, okay, that's the one. So that is the water carrier, and part of the scheme of diverting the Jordan River to use for making the desert bloom in the Negev. Well, that was the story that we were fed, but actually it is to cool the nuclear reactors in Dimona. So, but we lost land for that. And I mean, to give you the feeling for how this business of confiscating land, the land that was used for this project all the way across the valley was confiscated by the government for public good, and people refused to bargain, refused to pick up the price that the government offered. And so people found out that they had a bank account in which the state deposited the really minuscule price for their land that they lost for this project. This is, I know, because we lost some of that land, okay? So the government tried to bargain. The folks refused to accept that, the money. So the state deposited it in their names in the bank. Eventually, they would receive notices that they owe the bank money for administering their account because all that the government put in it has already been used for fees, and now we owe the bank some money. And that's how we knew that the state had deposited the money for us. At any rate, this is a silly joke, but it is real. At any rate, this most fertile valley is the only piece of real estate in the entire state of Israel that lacks irrigation. And that is because it is still over 80% of it is owned by Arabi, our village, and by the next village, Sakhnin, it's owned by Palestinian citizens. And it is the only one in the entire state of this size that's not irrigated. Okay. Let me go to the most important thing that I did in my life. I worked for the Ministry of Health. Very quickly, I started getting uncomfortable with the situation. I'm running a shop that was supposed to do public health, and I just didn't have the okay to do anything meaningful in public health. I did the minimal possible to, meaning my office, the nurses and the doctors and the so I started writing memos up and down the system to my bosses and nobody had the time to even oftentimes to answer. But the standard answer, well, you know, and there's history behind this, and this is, at any rate, I felt very uncomfortable representing the state to my clients. And this came to a head in 1976. In 1976, another batch of land, and now you can show that picture of the next slide. Mm-hmm. This is at the lower right side is my village, Arabi. At the middle, on the left, is the next village called Sakhnin, which is a little larger than Arabi. And then that is, no, Sakhnin is a little lower and further to the left. Further to the left. Right there. That's Sakhnin, that's just the edge of it. But there is a third village called Deir Hanna on the right, the far right, at the middle. That's the far right. At any rate, those three villages owned the area in between them. That area is known in the military lingo as Area 9. And this is something from the British Mandate days. This area was used for targeted practice during the Second World War. There was a British military camp at the edge of Arabi, and the whole area used, which is farming land for mainly olive orchards. The military would come and inform the villagers that on such and such a day there's going to be target practice, the area is closed. When Israel came, it started a new twist on that. It is always closed except those who want to enter it to farm their land would get a permit for it. And in 1976, Sharon was the Minister of Agriculture, and he had a major plan of establishing what was called a lookout community, Jewish settlements that oversaw the areas, the valleys in the Galilee, to protect those valleys from their owners, from the Arab villagers. So, for example, this area, there are about 5 different new settlements that were supposed to be established there and actually were established. But the original plan was to establish them as agricultural communities. And where would they do their agriculture? In Area 9, which stopped being military anymore and became civilian. And people who owned land there, which means the 3 villages that I pointed to you, Arabi, Deir Hanna, and Sakhnin, received notices that their land is being confiscated for the public good. And for the first time, remember, this is almost 20, almost 20 years, 18 years after the establishment of the state and after we have been under military rule. We were under military rule till 1966. Now we're talking about 1976, 10 years later, that people received notices of land confiscation. This was the first time that the Palestinian community in Israel as a whole stood together and said, no, we are not accepting this one. It was a massive land confiscation for these 3 villages. And these 3 villages got the support of the entire Palestinian minority in Israel to say no. And how did they say no? They announced that on the 30th of March, we are going to strike for 1 day. See how big that is. 1 day strike. Well, Rabin was the prime minister, and Shimon Peres was the minister of defense. They said, no, you cannot strike. And so it became a confrontation. That confrontation, as we approached the 30th of March, pressure increased, and the state encouraged a group of, let's say, friendly mayors from the Arab villages to band together and hold a meeting so they would pacify everybody and convince them not to strike. They met on the 29th, the night before the scheduled strike, and there happened to be a really charismatic man named Tawfiq Zayed, who was an excellent poet. I mean, beautiful poetry he wrote, but he was a great politician as well. He was the mayor of Nazareth, and he was a member of the Knesset. And he, as a mayor of Nazareth, he attended that meeting. He had the greatest sense of humor. I mean, he couldn't say 2 sentences without a joke. He had a fantastic sense of humor. And with his sense of humor and his poetry and his excellent command of the Arabic language, he turned that meeting around. And they left with a decision, everybody is striking. That was announced, and we're talking about the 29th of March. That night, Paris sent in the crack troops of the Israeli armed forces. They came into our villages. You know, the choice armed force parts that are sent on dangerous missions to Lebanon and wherever, they were sent into Arabi, Sakhnin, and Deir Hanna, these 3 villages where the confiscation was to take place and where the strike was at its strongest. Well, that night and on the 30th, that day, we lost 6 young kids that were shot to death. But my experience, and this is, I'll now share with you my own personal experience. I woke up in the morning to see something I never saw in my life. Tanks right across from the front yard of my house And my neighbor across the street was shouting to me that his wife has gone into labor. Could I come and help? I took my bag, held my stethoscope, and stood at the door of my house and waved my stethoscope at the soldiers. And one of them took aim at me and I ran in. I ran in and I told my wife, this country is not for us to live in. We are leaving. I wrote a letter of resignation to the Ministry of Health, and we bought a ticket and we left to Hawaii. The Minister of Health refused my my resignation and said, your job will be waiting for you. We went to Hawaii. I think we can see the next slide. Okay. That's us 2 years later. We went to Hawaii. I worked for Kaiser Permanente in one of their outlying clinics for 2 years. We became part of the community. So when we were leaving, everybody came to the airport to see us, friends, and some of my clients, patients, and relatives, and so on. So our excuse for not staying in Hawaii. And that was not the first time that I ran away from Hawaii. When I finished my internship in 1970, I was offered a very lucrative offer by the hospital to run the emergency room for them, with a figure I never dreamed I could possibly accumulate. But I left it behind and I went back, and I'll share with you, just for entertainment, a joke that I tell in my book of memoirs. And the story is about, okay, bear with me, this is just for comic relief. In Arabi, they tell a story about the village fool who bought a donkey. And people, the neighbors and everybody asked him, well, why did you buy a donkey? What for? And he said, oh, to collect grass on it and carry the grass home. They told, but you don't have cows, you don't have cattle, you don't have goats. What do you need the grass for? He said, to feed my donkey, of course. And that's, I mean, honestly, that's what it felt if I had stayed as a physician in the United States. I would be making money so I can spend it. And that never really felt right for me. And so this is the second time that we returned to Arabi, this time with the excuse that our children who have those flower lace on their necks, they went to school, and we realized that was not a very safe place in the United States. There were guns at school and there were drugs at school. And we decided that the warmest environment to raise our kids was Arabi, among their cousins and their uncles and aunties. And so for the second time, we left Hawaii and went back. Now, okay, now I went back, this time determined that I'm not going to keep quiet with the Ministry of Health. I had access to the, on a direct line to the Minister of Health, who was a leftist, and I tried to get him to do something about the health of the Palestinian community in Israel because it was really neglected. So I started looking around, writing, as I said, memos. When I saw that memos are not helpful, really, I consulted with 3 other physicians, friends of mine, local physicians. By then, there were other physicians. And we decided we will establish a charitable organization to promote health for the Palestinian minority in Israel. And we did. We registered a charitable organization. We didn't know what we were doing, but we learned. And we started looking at what is needed for our community, to improve the health of our community. The one thing that we discovered, I mean, we learned, it took a while to learn, but we learned that, in fact, this is part of a design. It is not exactly that nobody remembered that there are Palestinians, but they were not in anybody's, priority thinking. We found several things, and bear with me while I just describe to you a couple of those, that were completely black and white, that every Jewish community had, and not a single Palestinian community had, in Galilee, in Israel. One of those was the sewage disposal systems. There wasn't a single Palestinian community that had a modern sewage disposal system. Everybody dug a hole and put the sewage in it because everybody had water supply. Homes were provided with water. So the balance of the water was disturbed, meaning people used to go to the spring and bring a jar of water, and they would use it very carefully, and it didn't make a problem. Now everybody has a water tap in his kitchen and in his house and in his shower, but nobody bothered to do anything about sewage. What do you do with the water after you use it? So everybody either let it out on the street or dug a hole in the ground and made an absorption pit and put the water in it. And so eventually, the Galilee is all hilly and rocky, essentially. And the earth cover over the rocks is very shallow in most places. And how homes and the communities are built on hills. And so it is rocky. And so the water would simply flow into the superficial layer of dirt. And that's where the water pipes are, the water supply pipes. So it was a perfect setup for outbreaks of enteric diseases. Okay, so that took a while to learn. How come every Jewish community had a modern sewage disposal and not a single Arabic community? Okay, so that was our biggest headache, my biggest headache. People didn't think much about it. It's sewage, well, water, whatever. But I'm a public health man. I can't see that and not think about the germs that the kids picked up on their way to school and back from school. So that was one. The second one, for example, there was a system whereby every Jewish elementary school had a dental clinic that's free of charge. It's supported by the state. Not a single Arab community had one. Not a single Arab school, elementary school, had a preventive dental clinic. Same thing for special kindergartens for mentally handicapped children. There wasn't a single one in the Palestinian community. Almost all Jewish communities had one. So we started looking at why is that? And started making noise about it and started trying to do something about it. And we did. We started projects on every one of those three things that I mentioned and on several other things. We started that in the Galilee Society. We started a project to address those issues. Okay, the Galilee Society is still thriving, doing very well. There is a younger generation in it. It dabbles more now in research issues than in addressing the community needs at the level we did before. But I'm very proud to have been able to leave this organization to a younger generation and for it to survive and progress. But on the way to having achieved this, one incident was a 1992 outbreak of measles among the Bedouins in the Negev. The Bedouins there are lots of issues I skipped too, but there are communities that exist from before the establishment of the state that the state says they don't exist. They don't appear on Israel's map of where you can build a house. So they are agricultural communities, but they existed and they had many homes and they had villages, entire villages that were skipped by the planners who made the plans for the law that was, I think, passed in 1978 or something like that, the planning and building law. So they became unrecognized villages, villages that should not be there, although some of them existed from the Ottoman days. This is true also of many of the Bedouin communities in the Negev. Because they are not supposed to be where they are, the state withholds services from them, including the Ministry of Health. We will give you services if you come over to the recognized communities. So what the Galilee Society did with I took leave of absence for a couple of years to lead the process and to establish what needs to be established. So one of the projects we had was a mobile clinic to do maternal child health clinic services for the Bedouins in the Negev. And when this outbreak of measles occurred with several deaths, we offered our services to do immunization through our clinic. And we reached an agreement with the district physician there, a lady by the name of Bill Maker, good friend of mine at the time. And so we sent a team of doctors and nurses in this mobile clinic to immunize children. Olmert was the Minister of Health. He knew of me, not through my position as the physician in charge of the Galilee. By then I was fulfilling the position of district physician for the entire northern district, entire Galilee. But he knew about me from his assistant, who was the shinbeit in charge of Galilee before. So there was this former shinbeit character who knew who I was and what I was trying to do. And he told Olmert, no, this guy shouldn't be doing what he's doing. And so Olmert ordered us out of the Negev. I mean, he sent a formal letter banning us from doing immunizations in the Negev. And immediately wrote me a letter that you have to choose between the Ministry of Health or the Galilee Society. Well, to make a long story short, I opted to stay with the Galilee Society, and I left the Ministry of Health in 1992. And I think with that, if we can see the next slide, please. From Hawaii to Arab Naim. This picture is with my friend Subhi Badarni, who is also, he's a health educator. And this is when we were establishing the Galilee Society. We went around and tried to feel the pulse of the communities in terms of what their health problems were. What did they think about what they need, and so on. And so this is in one of those sessions in a Bedouin community called Arab Naim. At any rate, finally, I mean, I'll just give you very briefly a couple of statistics about where the situation, the overall situation of the Palestinian minority in Israel is. We have to compare our well-being, and this is my view. Let me go back a bit. If you ask Israelis or Israeli officials about the welfare and the situation of the Palestinian minority, you will be told that we are better off than all other communities of Palestinians in the Middle East, which is true. The statement is supported with statistics. And as a public health man, let me share with you that, in my opinion, the one statistic that really gives you the shape of the community, the well-being, reflects the well-being of the community, is the infant mortality rate. What does that mean? That means out of every 1,000 live births a year, out of every 1,000 live born infants, how many of them die before they reach their first birthday? That figure really gives you the overall well-being of that community, because you're talking about the weakest part of the community, the most vulnerable group in the community. Infant mortality rate reflects not only the health of the community, it reflects the overall situation, well-being of the community. By the way, just for your information, physicians in the audience will agree with me that infant mortality rate is affected mostly by three main, we're talking now professional public health, affected by three main independent components. It is affected by the level of income of the father or the family, the level of education of the mother, and the quality of drinking water. None of those is medicine. The infant mortality rate reflects how well the community is. Now, since Israel was established and statistics have been kept, the infant mortality rate among the Palestinians in Israel ran exactly twice the level of infant mortality rate in the Jewish majority in Israel. Okay? Twice. 2-1. When the Jewish majority had infant mortality rate of 20, we had infant mortality of 40. When the infant mortality rate of the Jewish community was 5, we were 10. So it is exactly 2 all along till Oslo. And after Oslo, the increased influence of the settler politicians. Their settler politics spilled back into Israel and started affecting the Israeli citizens who are Palestinian, affecting them in a way to retard their progress. And therefore, the infant mortality rate since 1990 to 95, since then, the ratio that I told you, since 1950 to 1990 ran 2-1 all along, started rising. Don't misunderstand me. Our infant mortality rate still going down, and so is the Jewish infant mortality rate. But the ratio, we are less advantaged, let's say, than by comparison to the Jewish community. I hope that point is clear. I'm not saying that our infant mortality is rising. I'm saying that our ratio to that of the Jewish community, because that's the essence of my approach. I want equal treatment. I would be treacherous to my, I would be not, I won't be honest to my profession if I ask for anything less than the maximum possible for my community. The maximum possible for my community is to be just like other citizens in Israel, like the other 80% of the population who are Jewish. That's the condition I want to reach. And as I said, we are the gap between the two in relative terms is widened. Okay, I think with that I'll finish. I'll just tell you that I think the Middle East has a long way to go in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, if you want to call it that, but that I am optimistic that things are on their way to changing in the right direction. And if you have, if you read Mondovise, I just wrote something a few days ago about the fact that all of a sudden, Haaretz, which is the oldest Hebrew newspaper continuously appearing in Israel, Haaretz published an ad by the Jewish Voice for Peace and 5 other pro-peace organizations, activists in the United States. That calls for boycotting Israel. And it says it openly in Haaretz. That's almost unbelievable. That means, in my reading, that means Israel is on the verge of starting to see the light, if you wish. I think we just to end on a positive note again, if you would show the last 2 slides, please. In my book of memoirs, the last chapter really tells you more about who I am and my community than probably anything else that I wrote there. It is a chapter about transferring this tree, which is scientifically estimated at 3,500 years, and actually 3,700, but 3.5 millennia, 35 centuries old tree that I transferred to my front yard. And the next picture is again about olive trees. Okay, this is the field that I inherited from my father with olive trees. And this is in the spring. And it's not only the olives, but those flowers are from plants that are edible, greens. I grew up eating that as part of my daily diet in the spring. And I think to think about getting me and people like me, the villagers in Arabi, to get them to give up that scene and those trees is not a realistic expectation. Thank you for listening so far. I'll answer questions if I can. And I went over the time.
Okay, so you'll have to bear with me and don't get distracted by the other part of the screen in which I'm looking for questions, and I'm just taking a look here. Just to repeat for the electronic audience, you will find in the control panel, which looks like this, something like this. It's not exactly the same as mine, but somewhere around here, you will see a picture of a hand. And if you want to ask a question, just press it, and I will see that your hand is up, and I'll try to get to you roughly in the order that you ask. Seeing no questions from the electronic audience, I'm going to ask the live audience here if you have any questions or comments on the presentation. Yeah, Dr. Zaid.
Do I come there?
No, you can just speak loudly.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Kanaaneh, for your excellent statements and so on. It confirms very well the claims we hear from Israel that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and its army is the most moral army in the world. We've seen the demonstration of how land is confiscated and how the military take over land and so on. You explained that very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go to... Yeah, you get to answer if you want.
Well, thank you for that. We are in agreement, so we don't need to comment anymore. Okay.
I should add, you showed us South Africa forest. Well, Dr.
Yes.
Zaid comes from Bet Nuba, and his old village, which was destroyed in '67, is now covered over by Canada Park, which is also our dollars going to support. So I'm going to go to Hélène B from our electronic audience. Hélène, I'm just going to unmute you and go ahead. Hélène B. I'm just looking for any other hands up. Well, I'll
Technical issue?
No, she may have raised her hand and then doesn't. I don't know, but I will. Oh, I see. Maybe. No, I'll just mute her and wait. And if she wants to ask a question, she can raise her hand again. And I will go to you.
Wondering, what was the effect of the one-day strike? What was the result of that? Was the land saved or not?
So the question is, what was the result of the one-day strike in 1976? Was the land saved, or what happened?
Yeah, very good question. As I said, the original plan by the agricultural minister Sharon was to build on top of all the hills like watch towers communities that would be agricultural communities. That plan was abandoned, and they all became bedroom communities for people who go back to the city to work there. So the original plan was scrapped. The communities were still built, but the land was not confiscated. And credit goes to President Wiseman, who was at one point, he was the, the commander of the Air Force in Israel, and he became the president of the state. Before he became the president of the state, he was a minister, and there was a ministry that you probably never heard of. Part of the cabinet in Israel, till very recently, I don't know whether it's still there or not, but I don't hear of it anymore. There was a position, a ministerial position called a minister without portfolio in charge of Arabs. Okay? A minister without portfolio in charge for Arabs. That was given to sort of small parties and so on. At any rate, President Weizmann, before he became president, he held that position, and he negotiated between the state, the government, and the Palestinian villages, including Arabi, Sakhnin, Deir Hanna, and I was present in person at one of those negotiation sessions, and he simply abandoned the plan, and those confiscations never took place. But we lost 6 young men and women in the process.
And was that land, what's now known as Land Day?
That's Land Day, which is celebrated every year on the 30th of March throughout the Palestinian community. That's Land Day. Thank you for reminding me of the name, right.
Okay, from our electronic audience, we have Janine Muller. I've unmuted you.
Thank you. Dr. Kanaaneh, thank you so much for your excellent presentation and your archival knowledge of the facts. I have a personal question for you. What, as an activist, what kept you going all these many years of dispossession and inequality? And how did you avoid bitterness? I don't see any bitterness in your presentation. How did you avoid bitterness at all the many injustices?
Okay, thank you for that question, which I take as a compliment. But let me say this. I think when you feel that you are fulfilling your mission as best as you can, and I think I have done that, that's the basic answer to your question. That I feel I did, and I'm still doing the most I can. After I finished my medical practice, and then after that, also the public health practice through the Ministry of Health and through the Galilee Society, after I finished that, when I decided it's time to retire, I just couldn't stop the main direction of my life, which seems to be a service of some sort. And I decided, you know, in retirement, and I'll share with you a little secret about the book that we mentioned today, A Doctor in Galilee, which is available, of course, on Amazon and I suppose through bookstores. But all through my life, since I was in high school, I hit on a trick, which later, when I was studying medicine, I discovered that it is an accepted trick, accepted practice that psychiatrists use. It is, as I said, since high school, I discovered that when I am really upset by something or excited about something, to be able to sleep, I would sit and write about it. And that's a way that psychiatrists advise their patients to listen the stress. So I did that, and I never read what I wrote. I didn't reread it. I just put it away. And by the time I retired, well, I'll continue that. When I had 2 full-time jobs, public health and then my clinic in the evening, there was no time to sit down and write. And there were lots of things that upset me. So I had bought my son a tape recorder. And that was faster way of recording than writing. So I would get up early in the morning before the children got up, and I would talk to myself on the tape recorder. And I put it away. And when I retired, for the first time, I started to read what I had written from high school on, and to listen to those tapes. And I swear to you, I cried so much when listening to myself as a young man, doing what, or saying what I was saying. And you know, that takes away the bitter edge of it, somehow, I believe. And don't forget, or I shouldn't forget, I married a beautiful woman that's very supportive. I have beautiful children. I inherited a piece of land from my father that I do gardening in it. I grow all kinds of fruit trees in it, and that's my connection to life. And I'm very happy with where I am. And I hope that that shows through that I am not that bitter. That's my explanation. I don't have a better one.
Thank you. The next question is from our electronic audience from Paul Weinberg. Paul, are you there? I have unmuted you. Well, if Paul wants to come back, I'm just going to mute him again. And any questions from our live audience? Any more questions? Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when your family, when you left with your family to Hawaii twice and you came back, how safe was that? Like, was it a bit risky to leave your home and come back? Like, or how, did you feel secure that your land would be there when you come back?
Larry, I didn't understand the question. Could you please explain?
Yeah, repeat it for me because I was busy here.
Well, asking about when the twice that they left.
The twice that you left.
And went to Hawaii.
And went to Hawaii.
Back. Well, my question is, you left your land and your home. So did you feel secure that that would be there when you go back? No problem with that? Did you feel secure that when you returned, your land would be there for you?
Yeah, that was not an issue because my land is not separate from the land of, I mean, it is in the center of the property of my 4 other brothers, and all of our joint property that we inherited from our father is right in the middle of an extended family property. And so that it physically was protected by everybody around. But more importantly, I traveled on an Israeli passport and I maintained my Israeli citizenship. And I never had any ifs or buts about where I belong. And so in essence, in terms of physically somebody taking it over, I wasn't worried. Like I am not now. I am in New York. Since my children grew up and settled, both of them, in the United States, and I and my wife retired, we spent about half of the year in the United States. And my nephew and his family take care of my house and my land, and no issues. I mean, Israel, it is not a lawless affair where people come in droves and take over your property like they do sometimes the settlers in the occupied territories in the West Bank. That doesn't happen inside Israel. Inside Israel, it is done through laws. There are, and I'm glad you asked the question so I can relate to that. There are over 3 dozen, the last count that an organization named Adala. Adala means justice. There's an organization, a Palestinian group of lawyers, actually with a young woman who is a Jewish activist from New York, married to one of the Adala, to the head of Adala. At any rate, there is an organization named Adala. Adala means justice, and it is the organization for justice for Palestinian minorities in Israel. Adala is a very significant organization. They have documented the last count, which was about 10 years ago, I think. They documented 36 laws on how the state of Israel can confiscate my land. So it is done through legal means. Legal means does not mean justice, but it's done through legal means. Whereas in the West Bank, there are frequent occurrences of settlements being put on Palestinian land without law, and then retroactively the state will recognize them. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I'm going to read, Paul Weinberg says that he was having difficulty being heard, so I'll read out his question. Can Hatim comment on the growth of the number of Palestinians in Israel who've gone into medicine in Israel? I'm assuming yes. Those last two words are the important ones in that sentence.
Right. Okay. That's a good question. And I hinted at it actually earlier. The medical field, the health field, let's say, is one of the least discriminatory fields in Israel. What do I mean by discriminatory fields? Take any ministry, essentially, and see how many of the employees in that field are Palestinian. And you will find that the Ministry of Health has the highest percentage. Let's say that the Ministry of Health and the government of Israel actually brags about the fact that the health system is the least discriminatory of all the various services in Israel. And if we speak specifically about the medical field, about medical practitioners, physicians, the top students, the bright ones and the ambitious ones in Israel, in the Jewish community, who go to the university for higher education, go into one of two fields, high tech and the military industry. Those take up the sort of the cream of the crop currently. And add to that, that many of the Israeli trained Jewish physicians find their way to the United States and to Europe, especially to Berlin and Germany. So there is a brain drain of physicians from the Jewish community, plus the number who go into medicine is not as large as it used to be. So altogether, there is high demand for physicians, and presumably physicians by training do not discriminate. A patient is a patient. That's how we are taught in school, and that's how we're supposed to think. The patient is, your duty is to save him, and regardless who he is, what color, what race, whatever. So these two combined factors open the door for Palestinian physicians to go into the field. And currently, not only physicians, but all the fields of health are opening more and more before our boys and girls. Now, for example, other than the physicians, where now, I mean, especially on Saturdays, the joke is that if you don't speak Arabic, you don't get served on Saturdays in a hospital, because that's the only ones you find on Saturday is Arabic speakers. But the number, I think, over 30% of, we are 20% of the population, over 30% of pharmacists in Israel are Palestinian. A good number of nurses, a good percentage of doctors. Wherever in the system you go, there are Palestinians who find their way into the system. Now, let me just add one more factor. For the past, 10, 15 years, there has been a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. Since they signed the peace treaty, I don't remember when they signed it, but since they signed the peace treaty, the Jordanian universities, for financial reasons, cater very specifically to our boys and girls. And for us, whether in the north of the country or the middle of the country, it's a very easy hop to Jordan to attend university there. This is again a reminder to explain to you that most of these physicians, especially physicians, are not locally produced. Families join force together, sisters and brothers save money to send the younger kid to go study medicine in Europe. That's where the majority of our doctors are trained in Europe, not in Israel, because the admission conditions and so on, long story. But in essence, it is in Europe that they train, and now they started also in Jordan. One last point, and I think it is only fair to say that we should acknowledge the fact that the major input into training of young Palestinians, in giving them higher education, was thanks to the Communist Party. Okay, saying that while I am here in capitalist in New York is, of course, not fair, but I'll say it. Let me say this. The Arab minority during the period of the military rule, as far back as then, had no voice. Nobody would speak on their behalf, except the Communist Party. for some reason, the Communist Party decided to invest in the Palestinian minority. We have the only newspaper, daily newspaper in the Arabic language is the Communist Party Daily. The major, I mentioned a couple of poets, Tawfiq Zayed, who was the mayor of Nazareth, Samih al-Qasim, who was also a very well-known major poet, and Mahmoud Darwish. All of those are communists. They were the ones that made the voice, the complaints of the Palestinian minority in Israel heard. And the Communist Party, for its own reasons, to sort of enlarge its membership and so on, would send promising young kids on full scholarships to East European, to the universities of the Soviet Union countries. And what they did, which is also still carries through as a tradition, is that they did not allow their grantees to settle in those countries. They had to come back, because that was the essence of the whole strategy, to have them come back and promote the Communist Party to their clientele. So all in all, this continues till now, that most those who go for higher education, whether lawyers, engineers, physicians, they all are trained in Eastern Europe. Add to that, that now it is done essentially based on the ability of the family to support this student to study abroad. It is very reasonably priced. The fees for studying medicine in Eastern Europe is very reasonable, and the living expenses and so on. So all in all, most of our physicians are trained in Europe. They come back to Israel. They have to pass a state examination, and then they do internship and specialty in Israel, in Israeli hospitals. I went on too long on that. But again, we are slowly getting at least our share of the jobs in the various branches of the Ministry of Health.
Okay, I'm gonna, my apologies to some people who, on the electronic audience who may have been waiting for a long time, but I want to take a question, if possible, and make this the last question from Corey Balsam, who's the director of Independent Jewish Voices, and he's in Montreal. I'm going to unmute you, see if you're still there. Corey?
Great. Do you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Anyways, thank you very much, Dr. Hatim, for sharing your experience and analysis with us. And thanks to Larry and IJV Halifax for arranging this talk. I think it's an honor for us to host you. I'm just wondering if you can give us, I hope this doesn't leave us on a negative note, but I'm wondering if you can give us a bit more of a sense of the interpersonal dynamics between Palestinians and Israeli Jews in the Galilee, in the areas where you're from. We hear a lot about the rise in anti-Arab views, particularly amongst youth. I'm just wondering, you know, is it a hostile relationship? I know, of course, people live together, and you know, you might speak at, you might be able to speak to work relationships, but how do you find the dynamic in general right now in that region between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. let's see. Let's say that the basic fault is with the original segregation by locale between Jews and Arabs. There are essentially no communities that are open to both Jews and Arabs to live in them. Of course, my village, Arabi, if a Jewish person comes and buys and decides to buy land, and he succeeded to buy land and to build on it and live in Arabi, that's theoretically possible. But practically, it really is not possible because of the preconceived ideas on both sides. But especially, I mean, a sane Jewish person wouldn't choose to live in an Arab village. I know some who did. But in fact, it is not practically an option. In the Jewish towns and villages and kibbutzim and so on, it is not an option. And actually, you of course would remember the law that permits each community to have a committee that can select who lives in that community. So that it is not really, there is very little occasion for the mixing, the intermixing of the two groups, except for the working age group where they meet at work. And I experienced that for some 20-some years. And I'm ashamed to say that after finishing my work career and stopping my office job in the Ministry of Health, I have kept in touch, I think, with only 2 people who are Jewish. But I don't misunderstand me. I have Jewish friends at home, but it's life is divided so clearly, geographically and socially, that there's very little chance to interact except on the job. That's the reality of life in Israel. There are those cities that are called mixed cities, like Haifa and like Jaffa, and so I know Haifa and I know Akka. In Haifa, the Arabs live in their neighborhoods, and there's, again, very little mixing between neighboring communities within the same city. In Ramleh and Lydda and Ramleh, the Arab slums are surrounded by a wall with what do you call it? The pokey iron,
barbed wire.
Barbed wire. Thank you for that. By walls with barbed wire on them to separate Arabs from Jews. As long as that is that's practiced, I don't think we can. And again, socially, both sides frown at the possibility of intermarriage. I think it is frowned at more by the majority than it is by the minority. But both sides don't think that that's a feasible option. Okay?
Okay.
I'm sorry not to be able to give you a better prospect than that. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And my apologies. There are a couple of more questions, but we really do need to draw this to a close. And I just want to remind people that this is being recorded, and after it's edited, Independent Jewish Voices will put the recording up on its website. Unfortunately, this particular platform does not allow, let's say, the presenter, Dr. Kanaaneh, for his video to be shown. I don't know why. So you will see the slideshow and hear his voice, but you won't actually see him in the recording, which is most unfortunate. But I want to end by thanking you, Hatim. This worked out beautifully. I know it's a topic we're all very interested in, and good. Have a good trip back when you go back.
Thank you so much, and thanks again, Larry, for all your good efforts.
Okay, thank you.